Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you another classic original 62 series book review, and it's book number 20, The Scarecrow Walks at Midnight. Now, I mentioned in a past video talking about, my journey with Goosebumps or, my history with the series, that The Scarecrow Walks at Midnight was a childhood favorite of mine. And right before I made this channel, I would say in the very early months of COVID, I read this book casually, and that got my interest kind of peaked back into Goosebumps as a series. So it's been a while since I've read this book, but I have read it a couple times as an adult. And after reading it this time, given some events have transpired in my life, losing both of my grandparents in the beginning of 2022, and just being flooded back with nostalgia and memories of reading this book at their house and stuff, this was a very emotional read. And I don't know how to explain it, but I don't know, this book touched something in my soul. And I try to separate nostalgia from these reviews sometimes because I like to judge what the book or episode or whatever I'm talking about is rather than what it isn't, and just take it at face value. But it's kind of hard sometimes, especially when you've been a lifelong fan and you have some emotional attachment to things. This is one of those times. So if it sounds like I'm going to be giving this book like a gushing review, just know that I have a weird connection with it. And it does have some issues, but overall, I would say I love this book. If you have not tried The Scarecrow Walks at Midnight, you really should go out of your way and read this. And especially around the fall time of year, like it is now, you will get a sense of that atmosphere in this time of year within this book, for better or for worse. And yeah, this is also a fan favorite Tim Jacobus cover. I've never really been too much of a fan of it, but over the years it's kind of grown on me. Yeah, it just has all the recipes for a great fall atmosphere book. So try it if you haven't. So let's get into the plot overview without giving too much away. So the story involves the main character named Jody, and I think she's like 12 and her younger brother Mark is 11, and they have arrived on a train to this Midwestern town, presumably, and they have this caretaker that comes to pick them up every time they go out to visit this area once every year for an entire month during the summertime, or late summertime, I should say. And Jody and Mark are about to take a ride with their grandparents' farmhand, Stanley, who has a 16-year-old son that lives at the farm as well, from the train station all the way to the farmland, which resides in this little small town with like nothing going for it. There's like a seed shop, a general store, and grocery store all in one, maybe a post office, very minimal things you need to be a town, right? And on the car ride, Jody and Mark, they're having some, spats, but they're excited that they get to spend another summer with their grandparents. And they overhear from this guy named Stanley that the Scarecrow walks at midnight. And this kind of sets this idea in Jody's head moving forward in the story that something is wrong with Stanley, because Stanley's been working with their grandparents for years, for almost 20, I think, as the book says, and he's never really acted this strange. And throughout the course in the beginning of the story, you get the sense that Stanley kind of reveals that he's been, dabbling in the superstitious. He's got this book that he's really invested into, and it's kind of starting to take over his, personality a little bit. And when Jody and Mark meet their grandparents, they're excited at first because they can't wait to eat some corn. And the grandparents are like, yeah, the corn is sweet this year. We can't wait for you to eat some with us. And Jody and Mark are just so elated that they get to, have their traditions and all of that. While Mark, he's the kind of kid, he's kind of lazy. He packs a bunch of video games and he wants to watch TV, but that's not what you're supposed to do at a farmland. And it reminds me a lot of how I was when I was a kid. I bring my Game Boy to my grandparents' house, but I never would play it because they would make me go outside and do things around the farm, which I thought was kind of cool. But anyway, there's a point where Jody and Mark start to, reminisce about, they eat a good corn dinner that night, and they get a sense that Stanley's still off with this book. And they ask the grandfather to tell them a scary story, but the grandfather's acting suspicious around this Stanley guy, and says, "Oh, I'm out of stories." And he's walking with a cane. He seems kind of older than they last remember him, and the kids think that something is wrong. And later that night, Jody, she's looking out her window around like 10 o'clock, and she thinks that these scarecrows that overlook the corn stalks out in the fields are like twitching. And she calls Mark to come look at it, and they both kind of witness this phenomenon, and they don't really know what to think of it. Well, it kind of ties into something that happened earlier that day. I kind of skimmed over it, where they meet Styx, who is Stanley's son, and Styx is kind of pranking them with these scarecrows and all that. And I'm skipping over this because I can get to very easy spoiler territory, so you know what to kind of expect. So I'm trying to be vague as possible. So the next day, Jody and Mark, they go downstairs for breakfast. They can't wait for their grandmother's chocolate chip pancakes, but her grandmother decided that she's not gonna make pancakes anymore because she thinks that they're fattening, and instead gives them cornflakes, which excites Stanley, and it's Stanley's favorite breakfast. And the two are like, all right, this is kind of strange, and they're wondering what's happened to their grandparents and why are they acting so apprehensive with them and around Stanley, right? Well, it kind of comes, as the story goes along, Jody starts to get these visions of scarecrows. And it started early on where she thought that, since she has allergies, and the story plays this up like she is allergic to pretty much everything on the farm. So the air kind of makes her eyes watery and she can't really see what's going on. She thinks early on that she sees a scarecrow hand trying to reach out and touch her and stuff like that. And this is the kind of stuff that she's been experiencing, right? So her and her brother are out trying to, I think, go fishing one day with Stanley. Stanley agreed to take him out fishing, and Styx is out on the other side of town, not really doing anything. I think he might be picking up supplies. And when they go down, Stanley's acting very strange. He has to do these superstitious walks around the farmhouse, which kind of strikes them. And they end up down to the river, and her eyes are watery because she's allergic to everything, and she thinks that these like weeds in the river are actually like straw hands from a scarecrow, and they're coming to like wrap around her legs. And she has this whole scene where she thinks she sees that. And while this is going on, her brother and Stanley disappear around the creek bed, and she thinks she sees a scarecrow moving off in the forest, and she screams and hollers, and she doesn't really know what she's looking at. And then Stanley comes to head, and then is like, "Hey, what'd you see?" And she's like, "Well, I think I saw one of the scarecrows," and that kind of alarms Stanley, and Stanley wraps up fishing rather quickly, pretty much leaves the kids to bring back all the equipment. And on the way back, Jody thinks she hears something inside of this barn, and she goes inside the barn to kind of, see if it's her grandfather. And she ends up getting locked in there, and she has another scarecrow vision, and she ends up interacting with this fellow named Styx. And Styx is like, he's 16 years old. He's kind of a prankster, and she's pretty much accusing him for pulling these pranks on her. And he's like, "I don't know what you're talking about, but all I do know is you shouldn't have come here, and you should listen to me. You need to stay away and don't keep prodding any further." Well, Jody files in the back of her head that Styx is obviously pranking them with these scarecrows. And it kind of comes to fruition at another part of the story where, Jody's kind of conflicted. She has this nightmare about her grandparents turning into scarecrows, or there are scarecrows that are coming after her in her dreams. And this is kind of more of a figurative story I think Stein is trying to tell with all this, like her gut intuition telling her that the grandparents are being affected by these scarecrows in some way, right? And it comes to head with an event where they have to, I don't know how to put this. They're doing something on the farm, because I don't want to spoil this part because it gives away a lot about Stanley. And they discover something that they think that is evidence that Styx could be behind doing these pranks, right? So they come up with this plan to dress Mark up like a scarecrow one night, just to get some revenge on Styx. And it pretty much builds up to the climax portion of the story. You have all this stuff kind of coalescing here. You have Stanley being weird around the grandparents, and you don't know why the grandparents are kind of like doing all this stuff to bend over backwards for Stanley. You have this mystery around Styx. Is he the one doing these Scarecrow things? And then you have like Jody having these visions of scarecrows with watery eyes and inside of her dreams. And it kind of makes you wonder if these scarecrows are actually real. Well, builds up to the climax, right? And Jody and Mark, like I said, they're trying to prank Styx. And in doing so, Jody gets kind of sidetracked and ends up actually interacting with potentially a real scarecrow that has come to life. And then Styx drops a bombshell about the whole motives of what's been going on with his father, what's been going on, for the past, I guess, small amount of time before they arrived at the grandparents' farm, and gets Jody up to speed with what's been going on. But Stanley kind of overhears this, and Stanley decides to do something to, I guess, clear his name and all of this, but just ends up making it worse. And it builds up to where pretty much all the characters in the story have this climax with potential scarecrows. And I don't want to go any further than that. And the climax comes and goes, and you may or may not see what happens with that. And then the ending kind of implies that there are some more unanswered questions, because if I'm being honest, I don't think there really is a real wrap-up to the story. It's one of those Goosebumps endings. After the climax is over, Stein gives you a page or two to wrap up the story. So there's not much of an ending here, but you get the sense that maybe some of this stuff isn't all over, and there are some unfinished business things going on in terms of what Stanley's been doing and all that. And that's essentially The Scarecrow Walks at Midnight. Now, it's purposely vague because if I got into any specifics about Stanley or anything, it would have completely spoiled the entire twist, and I don't want to spoil it for you. So, yeah, that's essentially, spoilerish, synopsis of what to expect in the book. Now, this book, in my opinion, has a lot of commendable qualities, and I guess I'll start off with the positives because I do have a lot. I really appreciate Jody in this book, and I think Jody is one of those one-note characters, but I do think that even for her being more one-note, she does have a lot more emotional empathy going on with her character, because you get the sense that she is very family-oriented, and she's very much interested in getting to know her ancestry and her heritage through her grandparents, and there's a genuine place of concern when she meets her grandparents after not seeing them for a whole year, and something has changed, and there's gravity to the situation that I think some kids or maybe some people haven't really experienced in their life, maybe before reading this book. But I'll tell you this, I've read this book many times, and I never caught on to it until after I lost my grandparents, to the fact that you literally watch your grandparents get older and older as you get older. And seeing the shock on her face when her grandmother was having trouble walking and her grandfather was put to a cane, they're lower on energy. This stuff is legitimate concerns that every human has, especially if you know or have been connected to your grandparents. And I think that love kind of protrudes to her character, and that concern of wanting to, get her old grandparents back is relatable. Now, I will say that Jody does get kind of wrapped up in this whole, is it real, is it not real stuff that Stein threw into the story with like dreams and, wet eyes and can't really see what's going on things with her character. And she also wants to get a little bit of revenge on Styx for something she hasn't really proved was him, just some situational, circumstantial evidence that kind of pointed the finger towards him. Yeah, that is kind of, I guess, annoying. But I do think that, for the most part, Jody was pretty well handled, even for those things, because she never really went too far. It was still innocent. She wasn't trying to hurt anyone or anything. So, yeah, I really like Jody's character. And that kind of bleeds into Styx and Stanley and the Scarecrow villains themselves. I think that this book is one of Stein's more figurative stories that he's ever made. Not in the sense that, you have to look at everything literal in the story, because if you do, you're going to get frustrated because everything is a fake out, right? I will be honest. The first half of this book is essentially all fake outs. It's stuff that Jody thinks she sees, but it's not really happening in terms of action in the plot and the overall story. This is all just things happening in her mind. which is one thing, but I do think that these things add up in kind of like a crescendo type of way. These things start off more innocent. Oh, she thinks she sees a straw arm. And then she thinks the straw arm is grabbing her around her neck. Then she sees um, a vivid dream with her grandparents that is absolutely frightening. You know, this stuff adds together, and these visions and these dreams are actually adding tension to the story. Meanwhile, you have Styx being a legitimate suspect behind potential Scarecrow pranks, and the reality that his father Stanley has done something with this superstition book that might play a role into these scarecrows that his father has himself made on the farm. And I don't want to get into any more spoilers than that. And there's just so much going on here. And then when you sit back and you think about what's going on with Jody, you think that, you know, all these things mean something, right? She's kind of like, she's pulling her intuition out into the physical realm or in the dream realm. And I think that it kind of works in this situation, even though at brass tacks, it's still all fake outs. So that's a long-winded way of me saying that I think Stein does a good job of telling a figurative story here with some legitimate mystery and some intrigue that, you know, kind of lands by the end in a lot of ways. I will say this, for Stanley's character, he is one of the most unique Goosebumps characters I have ever read before or since, you know, starting this channel. I think Stanley is memorable for all the right reasons because, you know, he's kind of a lovable idiot archetype, but then again, you know, his motives and stuff, you really can only get a sense of that in this book. And I've never been able to find someone like Stanley in some other form in Goosebumps. And Stanley's just such a fun character. And once you learn like what happened in the story and his involvement in all of it, you kind of, I can see people being frustrated with his character, but I think that kind of adds some more warpness to the story, especially given the climax of it all, and which I don't even want to spoil, but the idea of the climax is very, you know, eye-opening because, you know, you're dealing with possible messages of things that you create. You're kind of playing the hand of God, and now you have to take, you know, the fate of life in your own hands. And what happens to these potential creatures and all that, you know, you'll read it. It's kind of like, you know, it's kind of dark. So I can appreciate Stanley's inclusion in the story. And I think that this book overall is definitely a slow burn, but it's a crescendo book. Everything adds on top of each other to a certain point, and then you get to the real meat of what's going to become for the rest of the book. And you have, like I said, there's emotions there. There's some legitimate tension with these dreams. There's a mystery to kind of chew your teeth into. And you're kind of wondering what really is going on with Stanley and the grandparents. So, yeah. Now, here's the thing. I will also add on to this that the atmosphere and the setting of this book does get to me a lot in some personal ways because my grandparents had a farm. They had a barn out back with animals at one point. They didn't really have them as I grew older, but they did at one point. It just brings back so much memories of that. But you do get a sense of a farm in this book. You see the cornfields. You get to go see the posts where these scarecrows are at. You get to go to a river nearby. You're exploring this whole town at one point, or at least you're driving through it. You get to, you know, see the characters go on ponies and go inside barns. There's so many different parts of this tale that it feels expansive, and I really like that. It's not really too much. It's not too stale. You get a sense of two houses. You get a guest house and a normal house that they all live in. I mean, there's a lot going on in terms of setting here. The atmosphere in the Prowse isn't the greatest I've ever read, but it's serviceable enough to put you in that fall atmosphere, and it's engrossing from start to finish. This is one of the easiest to read Goosebumps books I have found in quite a while, even though it's 122 pages and it's kind of a slow burn. It's still quite quick and easy to burn through it, and I really appreciate it for that. Now, the negatives, though, I'm gonna be honest, Mark is kind of annoying. He is the lazy brother. He does some things in the story that are just really dumb, in my opinion. But he's still kind of like the lovable idiot. But there are some scenes in the book that just really annoy me about Mark. And like some things that happen are more understandable. But yeah, he's just there to kind of be the toady younger brother. And he's not even the biggest negative. I'd probably deduct 0.1 on him. But yeah, he did get under my skin a little bit. So that's one mild negative. The next few things kind of add up all together. It's kind of like the build up to the climax and then the ending itself. I'm going to speak on the ending because that's quicker to talk about. The ending is so abrupt and very short that I don't really feel like we get a sense or the whole scope of how things have changed up to the ending. I don't really feel like the things that we got with, Stanley in particular and what, he's doing really makes sense of it all, because if all this stuff happened because of Stanley's involvement with certain things, why is he still involved with certain things? And yeah, and I feel like there is some setup and payoff dealing with a certain thing inside of the house of the grandparents, but still it's there for the sake of a cliffhanger twist ending, and it's kind of, whatever. Not a big fan of the ending all that much, but, it isn't terrible or anything, but it's not my cup of tea. But that leads to the climax and the handling of it, I should say. And here's my whole point of view with the climax. You have all these things converging. I've already touched on them. You got the mystery behind Stanley and the grandparents. What's going on with that? Is Styx the one behind these scarecrows or anything like that? And then you have Jody's visions of scarecrows. Are these things real or are they not real? What's the distinguishment on that? All this comes to a head. All these characters get involved in the climax. And the climax legit only lasts like 3 to 4 pages. And it wraps up rather easily. Right? And it almost seems like the solution to handle whatever is being handled is a little too convenient. And it makes me think, like, why wasn't this stuff done earlier? Right? Why did they let it continue as far as it did if they could have just done this the whole time? Yeah, and I'll just leave it at that. It's one of those things that, hindsight is kind of 20/20 for this. I feel like Stein did not spend enough focus on, he definitely wanted these things to converge. He definitely wanted all these characters to be involved in the climax. But I think the afterthought was, okay, well, how do we make a reasonable sense to handle these potential creatures? Or whatever Stanley's doing, right? And I feel like he kind of fumbles the bag a little bit in the climax. It's a little too simple, a little too convenient, kind of cheap. And it just, like I said, it makes me think that why wasn't this stuff done earlier to kind of, absolve the situation. And then I can, I guess, go over one last mild negative, and that is the annoyance with the fake outs and like, the brass tacks of it all in the first half of the book. There's nothing really substantial going on in the first half other than these things pile on and matter in the back half. So you have to kind of slog your way, and I say that with with parentheses here. You have to go through all of this stuff to understand what that means near the end. And yeah, like I said, there are some scary moments with it, but it is a thing that I think will annoy most people, and it did kind of annoy me after a certain point because Stein it seemed like almost every chapter cliffhanger was a fake out. And that does get old. It wasn't cheap like the ones in like Headless Ghost, where you're touring a haunted house in the middle of the book and you're just getting nothing but fake outs during the actual meat of the story. This is all exposition fake out stuff, so it's kind of different, but still in the same vein. But all in all, The Scarecrow Walks at Midnight. What do I think of this book? I think I love it, but it's on the lower end of love. And for me, loving something starts at like a 4.3 out of 5 or higher. So I knew at the basis of everything, I was going to give this probably like a 4.3. All the negatives I have do add up, though. Like the convenience of the climax, the kind of lackluster ending to it all. Mark being slightly annoying, the fake outs being slightly annoying. That added up to about 0.7 for me, and I deducted 0.7 off the top from 5, and I settled with a 4.3 out of 5 for this book. Is it the greatest Goosebumps book ever? No. I do see a lot of people being really harsh on this book these days for some reason, though, which kind of perplexes me because it feels like years ago, this book was a whole lot more popular than it is now. And that kind of strikes me, like what changed. And I think over the past, like, maybe 5 to 8 years, as more and more people jump on the bandwagon that is the Goosebumps movies, and they're, turned on to like Abominable Snowman of Pasadena, or Fifi the Vampire Poodle and Please Don't Feed the Vampire, or The Werewolf of Fever Swamp, or Slappy because they're monsters in the movies, Scarecrow stuff gets tossed to the side. And it kind of gets less and less talked about. And I just, I think it does deserve to be, an all-time classic Goosebumps book. For a mascot book, for this book spawning the Scarecrow mascots that were used in the 90s for a lot of merchandise and stuff, this is one of the better ones, in my opinion. I've always thought that. So, yeah. And plus, the sentiment I have with, my connection of reading this book at my grandparents' house and all that does add up for me. It might play a role in me being a little more generous than I feel some people would with this book. But I think I'm being perfectly fair when I say that I would say this book is about a flat, middle-of-the-road B, maybe upper B-tier book. Some people might give it higher, people might get it lower. I totally understand, but this is just where I'm at with it, okay? So, that's my thoughts on The Scarecrow Walks at Midnight. Let me know down in the comment section if you've read this book before. Do you love this? Do you hate this? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.